my name's Claudia Luke, and I'm the director of the Center for Environmental Inquiry at Sonoma State University. And our goal at the center is to give you knowledge, skills, and experience needed to help you and everyone find solutions to environmental challenges. And as part of our work, we manage a 3,600-acre research and educational site in Mendocino County called the Galbraith Wildlands Preserve. So if you're interested in learning more about us, please check out our website at cei.sonoma.edu. Now, this workshop is the first of a three-part series about good fire, and we're going to have more information about the other two events at the end of the workshop. Also, I wanted to point out before we get started that this workshop is just a little different than what you might be used to. We're focusing here on skill building, helping you learn new skills during the time that we have together. It's about an hour and a half we have together. And what we're hoping is that you'll leave here today with new observational skills that'll help you determine whether or not forests on your property could benefit from fire. So for the agenda today, to do that, we have two guest experts who are going to show you features of environments in Mendocino County that will help you predict forest health and fire behavior. And they'll also be taking you, in addition to their presentations on this Zoom, we're also going to be taking you to a pre-recorded, really short videos of them describing different sites that we visited earlier. And then after these presentations, we're then going to give you a little bit of time to practice what you just learned. We're going to give you a 360-degree image, and we hope that you are going. I see one of our speakers just arrived, so I'm really happy. This is lovely. After we do the presentations, then you're going to have a chance to practice trying to use those new skills. So as we're going through, think about what is it that you might be able to see in the environment that will help you determine the health of the forest or the behavior of fires. And then finally, the last thing that I want to say is I want to thank the Mendocino County Fire Safe Council for a grant that made this event possible, and also for the staff that are supporting us today. Gina Valeria is helping us with the tech, and Margot Rollins is our outreach coordinator at the Galbraith Wildlands Preserve. And then finally, I want to thank our two guest experts who are here today, Dr. Sasha Brolman and Fire Chief Andres Avila. So first, I'm going to introduce each of them separately. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sasha Brolman. Dr. Brolman is a director of Fire Forward, a program of Audubon Canyon Ranch that trains and supports community members to be self-sufficient in prescribed burning on their properties. And she earned her doctorate in wildland fire science from UC Berkeley and is a founding member of the Bay Area Prescribed Fire Council, co-chair of the Good Fire Alliance, Prescribed Burn Association, and she's a state and federal prescribed fire boss. Sasha will be showing us features in the environment that help you predict forest health and resilience to wildfire. And please, we will have a Q&A sessions following both of these presentations. But as you go along, please go ahead and stick your questions into the chat. We're going to be accessing the chat to make sure that we get your questions answered. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sasha.
Hi, folks. So happy to be here today. I'm going to jump right in to some detailed slides on fire ecology. Thank you so much for the introduction, Claudia. So yeah, I wanted to give some background first today on the role of fire in our California ecosystem. So this is a great paper that came out way back in 2007 that Scott Stevens and others put together that really looked at just how much of California burned prehistorically. And we were looking at 1.8 million hectares, which is about 4.5 million acres. And if you look at recent fire history in California, that really matches only 2020 and even 2020 in wildfires that were burned. And even then, we were under the estimate for what was normal in a regular decade historically, or annual, in a regular single year annually in California historically. So fire was very much present in California prehistorically, and a lot of that was lightning up in the Sierras and up in the Klamath, but in a lot of California that was indigenous burning, and the Bay Area was no exception to that. So this is a map of tribes local to the Bay Area prior to pioneer arrival, and really the reasons people were here are very much the same as the reasons people continue to be here today. And that's that there's so many resources to steward here to live a great, thriving life. And so these areas were really heavily stewarded, and you can really see that in the plants that exist in this area. So this is just a kind of thrown together demonstration of how frequent fire was and how frequently adapted these ecosystems are to fire on the landscape. So this FRI is fire return interval, and we've got the median and then the high end of the range, and these are years. So for a black oak woodland, the black oak woodlands are adapted to fire about every 2 years, at most every 8 years. Other oak woodlands maybe go up to 10 or 11 years before fire, and that's fire returning at any individual point on the landscape. So each of these trees in each of these oak woodlands is adapted to seeing low intensity fire about every 2 to 10 years. And then as you go down this list, the frequency of fire kind of increases or decreases in frequency. And we get places like redwoods that in a lot of places are adapted to fire every 10 or so years. And that really varies dependent on the specific redwood stand, but still pretty high frequency. And the ways that plants deal with these conditions are variable. So you may end up with resprouters like redwoods or like bay laurels or oaks, and you can end up with like trees like ponderosa pines that have really thick bark. And then you get trees with serotinous cones, which are glued shut, waiting for fire to come and open them up. And so those are obligate seeders. They have to have fire so that they can drop their seeds onto an open landscape, and they're really adapted to high intensity fire that wipes out all of the standing living plants to make room for the new generation. And then there are trees like avoiders that don't really like being exposed to fire and generally grow just in the cooler areas where they can't be found by fire as easily. And historically, that included Douglas fir. So Douglas fir is not very adapted to fire. It's more of an avoider. In our ecosystems, in our grasslands, the brown hillsides that people are used to seeing are really not what fire or what our grasslands used to look like. So prior to pioneer arrival, they were dominated by wildflowers and our native coastal or our native bunch grasses that stay green pretty much year round and have really deep roots. But since pioneer arrival, we have annual European grasses that grow in these mats, and they die off every summer. So we use fire to reduce the cover of that thatch and make room for our native wildflowers and grasses. And then in our coastal prairie, if we remove fire and we remove the big native grazers, then we start seeing coastal prairie completely disappear. And that's an ecosystem that is really adapted to frequent fire, and there's only 5% of it left, and it's the most diverse grassland ecosystem in North America. So really a key one that if we want to see coastal prairie survive on the landscape, we need fire, or else it gets replaced by coastal prairie or by coyote brush, and then that gets replaced by Douglas fir. So this is a place where we're doing a restoration project where in 1987, you've got this photo, these blotches of coastal prairie. In 2018, you see a lot of Douglas firs growing in there. And then we started doing some restoration using fire and some cutting of the firs. And now we're opening that coastal prairie back up. Something that's really common both in coastal prairie and in oak woodlands is Douglas fir encroachment. So you can see here a lot of Douglas firs growing up, covering that coastal prairie up. So we'll go out and open up those areas and make room for the coastal prairie again. The same thing happens in oak woodlands. So this is just demonstrating what people walk around and see as Douglas fir forest is usually in California, what was historically an oak woodland and has been overtopped in just a short number of years by Douglas fir. So those bottom two images are oak woodlands that have been encroached by Douglas fir. They're not conifer forests. That's not what they're adapted to be. And this is a really big problem because our oaks are so diverse and they provide so much habitat and food source. And you can use fire to kill them directly until they're about 6 feet tall. So like in that piercing stage, sometimes up to 12 foot tall. But once they get past that, it's really hard to kill them just with fire. So then you start having to add in some hand piling of those and removal of in other ways, including pile burning. I think I'm going to call it there to make sure there's time for some question and answer. And I'm looking forward to chatting with people and answering questions. Thank you.
So we're next going to hear from Fire Chief Andres Avila. Chief Avila is the fire chief of the Anderson Valley Fire Department, which responds to fires and other emergencies within a 336 square mile area. He's one of the state certified California burn bosses and has years of experience in prescribed burning. And Chief Avila will be showing us features in the environment that can help you predict fire behavior.
Thank you very much for having me. This is a broad topic. I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of lessons and visuals when we go out to the field. But I'll try to cover what I can in a very short period of time here. Sasha will also be able to chime in on these when we go out to the field and kind of they're inextricably linked, both the ecology and fire. So basically in the fire service, on the fire side, specifically wildland, we get a lot of questions about like, what's fire going to look like when it comes through my backyard? What is it going to look like when it comes at my house? Or, and people have visions of things, and it's very hard to recreate that. It's not a politician's answer. There's so much involved in fire as far as what it's going to do, how to predict it, what it's going to do in June versus what it's going to do in October, what it's going to do in the coastal ranges versus what it's going to do inland, wind events. All of these things are major factors in the way that fire works. So there's not enough time in this video to go over all of those, but we want to give you a very brief understanding of how fire works, to our disadvantage and to our advantage when we want to bring good fire back on the ground. So Sasha was mentioning many things about, how fire was used. I want to briefly give you guys a quick overview, and it's not a PowerPoint, of how what we call the fire triangle. Many of you probably have seen this before. So there's this fire triangle in the wildland area that firefighters and prescribed burners use, and it's basically these three groups: fuels, topography, and weather, in a relationship in order to either go very big or stay under control or anywhere in between. And when people think of fire, and what we've seen over the last 5 years is fire can go very wrong very quickly, especially over drought conditions. And when we see all three of these factors come together, when fuels get really dry, when we have a lot of fuels on the ground, things like when we had the snow come in a year or two ago, where we have fuel now laying on the ground, there's a lot of available fuel to burn, especially when it's dead and not alive. Another factor is topography. What fire does on a flat ground versus what it would do on slopes. What it would do in a canyon versus, maybe a ridge top. These things are all variables in the big fire soup as we put it together and as we analyze what it may or may not do. The third factor is weather. This is one that we don't have a lot of control over. Obviously, summer and wind events and stuff like that will make fire go very large. Then for prescribed burning, we look at these other weather factors for typically spring and fall, for when the best weather conditions are for doing prescribed burns, and that's when it's not as hot, when it's more favorable. Weather is consistent of many things, as we all know. Wind. How's wind going to affect this fire? Is it going to push it along? Is it going to dry things out? Is there sun on the fuels that you're burning, or is your prescribed burn underneath a canopy where it's shaded and things might be a little bit more humid? Is there rain on the way? Was it rain last night or a couple days before where there's dewdrop or relative humidity in the area? What are the temperatures like? Is it getting pretty warm out there? Weather's a major factor and very dynamic. What it does in the morning, at 8 a.m. versus what it's going to do at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, or even for that matter at 8 o'clock or midnight during that burn period, are all factors one needs to look into it. So when we talk about fire behavior is very dynamic, and there is no one size fits all answer for controllability for fire. So going back to the original question, what's fire going to do on my property? What's it going to do? Will I be able to survive if I'm here? There's no real way to answer that question. We can always go with the worst case scenario, but it's hard to deal with that. When it comes to prescribed fire, on the other hand, we look for parameters to find the controllability using these three factors and putting good low intensity fire on the ground. And that's where certain practitioners can put this together in a good way. I want to go to a quick couple slides because I know we go quick through this. And I want to make sure that you guys have some visuals to relate what fire looks like. All of these, for the most part, are prescribed burns, and I'm showing you these so that we can take a lot of what people see in fire. When they think fire, they think the wildfire, and fire is very big. It's consuming everything, and these pictures will kind of show a difference of what you'll see more of a prescribed burn and what might a fire look like on, say, your property. This happens to be in the area of Yorkville and Fish Rock Road. This was an understory burn. In this picture, you can barely even see flames, some smoke coming out. But we were burning the understory in this area, burning away small saplings and duff and things of that nature. And we burned this, I think it was about 10 acres. I forget what the actual acreage is here. But burned the understory very effectively with a small group of, a dozen people or so. And we're able to burn the understory around some houses and some things that were pre-treated. But this is a very typical burn in our area, and was an effective burn that was that I would say was a great success. There are other types of burns. This burn was a floodplain, a very grass model, light flashy fuels, really controllable. The smoke went away really quickly, but the purpose here was to reduce the amount of buildup in a floodplain. And what this was able to do was it was a quick burn, didn't have a lot of oversight after, and firefighters were able to do this without having any water more or less used on scene. It just was able to burn it with drip torches and blowers. Really controllable, quick burning fuel. This is the same picture of that model, not having to use water. A lot of people think you have to use water for these things. Water's great to have on hand in case things go wrong, but it's not always the case if people have done their analysis right for your fire and how the activity will be. This was a fire we did up in, if you guys are from the Boonville area, I know some of you folks are from out of the area, up on Peachland Road. We were doing some understory and it got a little bit bigger in here, but it actually worked out to the owner's intent. We were able to burn a lot of understory and kill off some of these larger trees that they wanted to see go away. We're starting to get bigger on the higher end of things, but if you are trying to get a larger change going on here, this can be useful, and the owner did want this to happen, and we were able to burn this effectively without any control issues. Another visual in the area, if you guys have sage around your property, this is a coyote brush, poison oak, monkey fist kind of model where we were able to burn again with no water. What you'll notice here is very steep terrain. This is unique. It's much different than that floodplain area where things roll a lot faster, can go a lot quicker. And this is an area that we were able to burn really effectively, and the owner was happy with it. Sasha can go into the reasons why the ecology is good, but as far as controllability, these things are really easy to do with the right tools, the right equipment, and the right expertise. I really want to lean on expertise as we go along. Another model, this is probably my favorite model of all of them. One, it's very steep, but this had a pre-treatment done. A lot of people get equip grants done, and they get what's called lop and scatter on the ground, and they get dead fuel that they've done a really good job of cutting limbs up from the trees, and they put it on the ground, and then it hardens out. It doesn't necessarily rot away. And this is where we came back and used prescribed fire to burn off these limbs. We'll refer to them later as tens and 100 or even 1,000-hour fuel sometimes, where we burned them out, and we're very successful in getting that remaining fuel that they had treated and put on the ground to burn away. And this was less than 10 people, probably 7 to 8 people on this burn, I think. So very, very effective way to get rid of it, and very cost effective. A picture of something after. If we do this right and we're controlling our fires correctly, we're not going to be burning the trees on the upper. There will be some black and things of that nature on trees, but as a whole, the fire does great benefits for the woodlands, and it doesn't destroy the untargeted tools. I want to bring in something else. Is pile burning is always a great tool. Don't think that RX burning or broadcast burning is the only one. My kids here love to burn with me. They're having a good time. I love to teach kids as well about fire and take the mystery out of fire, and get our youth back into this kind of thing. And this here is one of those incidents where I just set my kids to things and do pile burning accordingly, in order to get rid of all those fuels that would be creating environments for other invasive species to get into. So this here is a picture of a suppression burn, but I do want to give this as a visual because people do have a lot of chaparral around the areas through Mendocino County, and may consider that the fire could get really large. This was not a prescribed burn, but this was a backfiring technique on a wildfire. We were using firing for burning out a fire in front of a fire. But this could be something you would see if you have chaparral, and it's not necessarily a prescribed burn that we would want to get into, but know that fire does come through in certain areas that would be very difficult control and could harm your home a lot. But we do see fire used by by professionals in this setting. It's this is one of those. So we want to avoid this, but it is another type of fire. That's my some of an overview on fire controllability, and the things that one might see within prescribed burning and different types of fire uses. I really would like to lean on the fact that if you want to go down the fire road, not to do it on your own. You really need to bring in experts and the proper plan, because if this gets out of hand, it can really go haywire quickly. And controllability and being able to know your own limitations is paramount in this whole program. With that, I will hand it over. I know that was very hasty, but I wanted to just give everyone a quick overview of the different types and varieties of fire, and the things that contribute to the fire controllability.
Great. Thank you, Andreas. We now would like to take you on a virtual field trip to a couple of sites. And first, we're going to begin with, there's two sites we'll start with. One is a site that burned 2 years ago, and one is a site that has not burned in many years. And we'll first start with that video of Sasha talking about the forest and forest health.
My name is Sasha Berleman, and I'm the director of the Fire Forward program at Audubon Canyon Ranch. And standing in this area today that was thinned by the landowner in 2019 and was burned by the Prescribed Burn Association and the local fire department in collaboration with the landowner 2 years ago in 2021. And what we see here is a nice open understory. Re-sprouts since the burn are below knee height, and we have spaciousness between the trees. They're all sharing light source pretty well. They have access to the water that they need, and we have a really nice understory layer of herbaceous and forb plants that are adding diversity in the understory. This is what we want to see in our forest, and this is a well-tended landscape. And why this is important is that all of these ecosystems in California have been tended by indigenous peoples for millennia, pretty much since the last ice age. And so they are adapted to that tending. They're adapted to people as part of the landscape, and they thrive in all those ways that I just discussed much better when we are doing that tending. So we have that higher diversity, less stress on the trees because they're not competing as hard for light and water. Drought impacts are reduced. Wildfire behavior is reduced as well. And we get higher resilience in the forest, less pathogen movement even. And so this is a great example of a forest that's been tended, it's on a good cycle, and that's going to have to continue over time. So that landowner engagement, watching those resprouts, and probably in the next couple years we'll be ready for another prescribed burn here to maintain that structure over time. Right now we have almost no duff layer, so that decomposing herbaceous layer is almost eliminated by that recent prescribed burn. We have a thin litter layer, so that's the leaves that are on the ground. And as that litter layer accumulates just a little bit more, we'll be ready to do another prescribed burn here, burning through that litter layer and reducing these resprouts back to under knee height.
Andres Avila, I'm the fire chief at Anderson Valley Fire Department. We're going to be talking about this site here. It's on the Big Tree Ranch in Philo. What we're looking at here is a forest. It has a canopy above it and a large open area. What you'll notice here is not a lot of density. The trees per acre are distributed compared to other areas that you may see further in the background. As we look around this site, there's not a lot of ground fuels, and most of the trees are large in diameter or are going to be potentially larger in diameter over time. We're going to point out a few things on the fire behavior. Fire has a lot of things involved in when it would go larger or stay smaller. Things like wind and topography, all these things have a lot of contributions. What we want to point out in this specific site is the density of the trees and the lack of limbs, or what we call ladder fuels, between the surface fuels and what's up in the canopy. So we can see a good distance between here, and there's not a lot of density and not a lot of different types of fuels, whether it's logs on the ground, trees, leaves, that are in between. When I look down at the ground here, it takes one handful of leaves and then I'm at the dirt. So there's only a limited amount of fuel there that's going to put out an X amount of potential, a BTU, heat release that's going to go into these trees. So as they move into these trees, there's not going to be a lot of energy to transition to the larger ones. With the lack of fuels to produce heat, you won't see as much fire behavior. It's a contributing factor. It's not the only one. There's a lot of other things, as I mentioned earlier. But the less amount of fuels on the ground, the better fire behavior you could anticipate in certain conditions. So that's our objective. The less amount of fuels on the ground, the less amount of fuels in continuity to the canopy. That's what we're looking for. And this is a great example of that behind me. If we were to burn this site, what we'd be looking for is enough leaf litter, we call them 1 hour fuels, to be able to produce enough heat to eat up the small tan oak sprouts you're seeing. So what we're looking for is on a day, today wouldn't be the day, we're on a rainy, wet day today, but if we were to burn it on a day that it was crunchy and we had the right conditions, it would produce just enough heat that would consume these small tan oaks very well, and they'd more or less be gone or just a little stem left when we were complete, just from that leaf litter, choosing the right day and the right prescription.
So this was, as you noticed, it was a site that's thinned and burned 2 years ago, something that both Andres and Sasha, identified that was really good for the forest. And now we're going to go to a site that it has not been burned for a number of years and take a look at that to better understand what features in that habitat would affect fire behavior and also the forest ecology.
My name is Sasha Berleman, and I'm the director of the Fire Forward program at Audubon Canyon Ranch. And here we're standing next to an area that has not been burned or treated in any particular way in recent history. And you can see it's dense with material, growing vegetation and not growing vegetation. So we've got really tall resprouts and seedlings, and we've got a really high density of trees growing behind me. A lot of those are young Douglas firs, and this is a pretty common thing that happens in Northern California, where when we remove tending and stewardship from the landscape, we see the number of small Douglas firs really skyrocket. And as they come in, any of those old, beautiful hardwoods and the higher diversity of trees that we like to see that add all these ecosystem benefits start to suffer. So if we have hardwoods in the understory, they get overtopped by those Douglas firs. Those Douglas firs aren't doing very well, they're not very healthy, and we see all those other trees that are underneath them that have been there for a very long time starting to die. The overall diversity decreases. We end up with a lot of fuel on the surface, and so the number and diversity of forbs and flowering plants and plants that produce berries, those all start to decrease as well. There is value for this type of ecosystem setup on the landscape. This provides some habitat value, but in pockets. And what we tend to see is that this is a very common state of being across these ecosystems in Northern California, and they result in a lower resilience to drought, to pathogens, and to wildfire. And so overall, we're trying to tend for a mosaic structure on the landscape, and we're trying to reduce the overall cover of this structure on the landscape and get the landscape to have more diversity, more areas where the forest is resilient to those stressors and can endure over time. And you can really see that here in the canopy. There's an old madrone that has come down, and that's something that we're seeing a lot of. Those hardwood trees just can't keep up once there's so much competition from all those small Doug firs.
So my name's Andres Avila. I'm the fire chief at Anderson Valley Fire Department. At this site, we're going to talk about fire behavior and controllability. A few things that come out immediately when I'm at this site is the density of fuels. We have a lot of fuels, small fuels, close to the ground, coming from our ground litter all the way up. Behind these trees and limbs, you can see some dead down fuel. A drone came down, took out a bunch of other trees on the way down, and put a lot of surface fuels down. It's all dead, dry, and very, it's going to put out a lot of heat if a fire comes through this area. This is challenging for firefighters. It's on steep terrain, so we're not going to really be able to bring equipment in here. So if someone was to come in here and do firefighting, it's probably going to be with hand tools or small things. But with the availability of potential heat in this area, there might be an area we just cannot achieve it. It's unsafe, not realistic to fight fire in here. So this area could put out a lot of heat. Very, very hard for firefighters to control, and we would not want to see a fire establish in here because of the potential that it would do, going uphill and into the trees and adjacent to it. So it has a lot of harsh impacts if it got into here and really got going, a lot of heat. So in this area, we'd want to reduce fuels and get rid of the stuff on the ground so that the fire doesn't have the ability to roll between each other or up. This is a prime example of what we would like to remove or try to see less of in the woods. Off to your right, downhill, was an area that was treated by hand, not by fire. And you can see a great distance in there. There is still fuel on the ground, but the amount of ladder fuels are non-existent or very minimal, and you would have much less potential. This is an excellent candidate to have prescribed fire in to clean up those surface fuels even further and make those fire suppression and controllability efforts more achievable.
Thank you. So we're really hoping that those videos give you a sense of what is needed for fire. What are the kinds of evidence that you can notice yourself on your own property and determine whether or not fire might be needed. We do have 2 more videos that we want to show you before we open up to questions to our speakers. And those are of a site that's recently burned. And we particularly wanted to show you that because some people find it a little bit shocking immediately after a burn. And we wanted an opportunity to for you to stand and see that property through Sasha and Andres's eyes. So we'll go to those videos, also very short, and then we'll open it up for discussion with our speakers.
Sasha Berleman, and I'm the director of the Fire Forward program at Audubon Canyon Ranch. And we're standing at a site that was just recently burned a couple of months ago. And you can see here that this is a pretty typical look for a woodland or forested or mixed evergreen forest burn shortly thereafter or shortly after burning. And what you see or notice, or what a lot of people notice right away, is like, wow, there's a lot of char on the ground, a lot of black, not a lot of color, and all of that green that I'm used to seeing in my forest is gone. Basically what we want to show here is that this is actually a really desirable trait in your forest in these patches when you're going for this mosaic structure. What you're seeing here, this char, is carbon that's really stable, that's getting turned back into the soil over time. A lot of nutrients have been made available to new plants, and you'll see when you look closely, there's actually a lot of green that's just about to come up in here, and it's in the form of a much higher diversity of herbaceous plants on the forest floor. And then our trees, being fire adapted, are adapted to different amounts of exposure of fire on the trunk. So in some other areas, we see that, redwoods are really well insulated and actually they're more resilient when they have char on their trunk. We kind of see through the whole range. Some other species can't handle a lot of char on their trunk or a lot of heat. And they're really adapted to very low intensity fire. So we have all these different ways of trees being fire adapted and adapted to very specific kinds of fire behavior. We also on this slope see that there are still some little logs on the ground, and those are helping to slow water movement on the landscape. And they will continue to be here and add that stable carbon back as we continue to do more burn cycles over time in this piece of ground.
Andres Avila with the Anderson Valley Fire Department. Wanted to go over a different site. This site we're looking at has a lot to point out. Probably the most obvious you can see here is black, with a lot of char. There's also a lot of remaining larger fuels, logs that were kind of left over. Want to talk about those a little bit because they have a lot of importance in whether you're determining to burn or not. This site was burned approximately 2 months ago. We're in January. I think we burned this in November. This was a lop and scatter. So they had a lot of hand treatment that was left along this hillside. And it was a lot of remaining surface fuels, as we discussed in earlier modules. This would produce a lot of heat in the summertime and put out a lot of damaging heat to these trees that are around. So we took the window in November to burn the fuels that are about straw size and a little bit larger, about 1 inch, maybe a little larger than that, and burn them up to consume as much of that surface fuel as we could. Now, it did not consume all of it. Some of these larger ones that you see back here retained moisture, and they just didn't burn within the window we had of this 1 day period. So that leaves some of these on the ground, but that's not undesirable per se. We did a very good cleanup with the hillside. The other thing to notice here is with the way that the fire igniters went through this module, there is heat that goes up and down these trees. We call it scorching. It goes onto the tree and you see some charring on these trees, but it did not get into the hardwoods and did not get into several of what we call goose pins, those openings or wounds on the trees. Some of these mossy trees, it didn't go up because we took a very slow and methodical approach to it. It wasn't a rush job. So we went through here and reduced a lot of fuels. Now, as we go through this, we may do burning down the road. We may just leave it, depends on what the owner wants. But this is a more technical site. The third component of this is slope. There was a really, really steep slope to this. You would not be able to get this to burn in this manner during that season if this was flat. So a lot of things were considered in this site, and we had some challenges. Surface fuels being dense, slope, and the window in which to burn it without hurting the live fuels that are here. So this was a good window and a good burn to do. I can only imagine how hot this would be if it was in August. And this is one of the benefits is burning it in those little small windows that we have. And this one, in my opinion, was done to the goals of to the landowner.
I wanted just to mention that the landowner, Dan Sicular, is here today, and just wanted to thank him so much for all the work he's been doing on his property and providing us access to those lands. So with that, I'd like to turn towards Andres and Sasha for first anything that you would like to add based upon what we've done so far, and to open it up to any questions from our attendees. So please turn on your mics, Sasha and Andres.
Sasha, would you like to add anything?
I don't think so. Just straight off those videos. I had something earlier and I lost it, but it'll come back to me.
I think the thing I would add is, you know, a lot of these burns, you know, for people who are on here, maybe looking at this for the first time, we're done with people, like I showed my kids earlier, but, you know, a lot of people who had never been on fires before. We use people of all different, you know, experience types. I think one of those photos had CAL FIRE in it. But there, you know, we bring people in who've never even, don't even know what a drip torch is per se. And being a part of these is a really good experience if you can get out on a live fire with the PBA, the Mendocino County Prescribed Burn Association, and see what they are. It doesn't take a lot of people if done right, and just get out and you know, get your feet wet or get your hands hot, I guess.
Yeah, I did remember what I was gonna say. But I would agree with that absolutely. Like, prescribed fire can range anything from a mother and her child lighting in the forest in winter to you know, a massive multi-hundred-acre operation with 100 people dressed in Nomex managing it. So there are all sorts of ways that people can engage with prescribed fire as a way to steward the landscape. And really the key thing is, if it's something you're interested in, getting involved in that prescribed burn association that exists where you live is a really key way, because you'll see fire on the landscape, you'll learn some of those basics, you'll get those foundations, and you'll become part of a community that is all learning and burning together. So that's really the best way to start identifying the ways fire may be a tool that you can use on your own property as well. And the other piece I really wanted to add is that like lop and scatter is a really great way to divide the canopy from the surface fuels. And I think Andre said it, like, there's a nuance in that is that, like, once you do that lop and scatter treatment, you are adding more dead fuel to the surface. And so if you do that as a lop and scatter, you do want to have a follow-up plan for how you can burn that area so that you remove that accumulated surface material and reduce the continuity and quantity of dead available fuel on the soil surface. Because that continuity is really what allows fire to spread, and the quantity is what attributes, or what creates the intensity of the fire, and then can result in severity in the fire or in the forest. So if you're going to do a lop and scatter, you want to have that burn plan to follow it up. You could also do something like pile burning so that you have that accessibility. Maybe broadcast burning is outside of your toolbox right now, but pile burning isn't. So there's a consideration there. And then I really do often advocate for prescribed fire as a first entry treatment in the winter. If you do it when a lot of that fuel that's on the surface is too wet and those ladder fuels are holding a good amount of moisture, you can really reduce the accumulated fuel load from 100 years of suppression, and then go back through and do your thinning and do a follow-up burn when you have less of that accumulated surface fuel as the foundation already underneath what you would add to it by doing a lop and scatter. So it's a little bit of a nuance, but I like to call it out for people just because sometimes people look at lop and scatter and they're like, oh, it's beautiful, now my job is done. But really there's an additional layer of complexity there. Aesthetics are not everything, and looking at actual fire behavior is important there.
So I wanted to bring up, there was a question here from one of our attendees, Angie, about, she says, what about an area that's been lopped and scattered a few years ago, but the limbs were left on the ground to provide mulch and erosion control? This is very steep terrain. Can it still be burned safely? I think she's talking about now that it's all dried out, does that make it dangerous?
I would say, depending on what your control lines or features look like, steep ground is definitely not a limiting factor necessarily for burning. Sometimes steep ground, like Andre said in his video, is actually exactly what you need to effectively do a burn. So it's more about these other features that would determine whether or not you could safely do that burn. Andre, do you have something?
Think that each one of these, and we're going to be a little bit evasive in our answers because each site really needs it's not this broad template. Each site needs its own visit to see what the goals and objectives are. So essentially, we at Dan Thickular's place at the Big Tree Ranch, he had just that. He had some lop and scatter that was on a knoll that had sun exposure that just made them hard, and they didn't have the soil wasn't wet enough to truly make the decomposition process work with that lop and scatter. So he just had hardened fuel, and he elected to go down the road of burning it. And then some areas it actually has good ground contact and does decompose. And maybe the method there is not to burn, and really being able to go through and say, hey, maybe this area could burn and that area can't. And each area needs to be really analyzed, one with controllability, but two with the ecological side. And it needs a good walk with the paradigm or the view of both in order to see if you get those goals and objectives. So yes, it can be burnt, but also is it the right tool? If you take everything off the landscape, like Sasha said in her video, it may have an erosion control issue. We may end up just having a blown out hillside. So you really need to look at it through the lens of what is the best thing to do. And fire is not always the best tool, but it can usually be burnt.
We have a couple other comments. There's one from Johanna. She's asked or commented, and maybe you could comment on this. How can we educate people who have lots of fir encroachment in oak woodlands? They're allowing the firs to grow and they're planting more firs in what is naturally oak woodlands. Do you have any thoughts about, have you seen that out there? And you have thoughts about that?
Andres, you got anything?
I don't know how we get the message out per se other than what we're doing. I live in Yorkville, and I live in a very beautiful place, 2 ranches that I run cattle on, and they have a very dominant oak woodland landscape, and we call it the weed of the woods is the Doug fir, and we see them sprouting up everywhere. And if you hit them early with prescribed fire, it can do a really good job. Just scorching them out, turn them brown, and it saves those oaks. So I see it spreading the word's really the best way. We can't require people to burn things. Maybe even it's not safe to do so. So I think just getting this whole cultural shift, this paradigm shift on getting rid of the Doug firs is really the first step. Finding areas that are low hanging fruit maybe is the next, so people can see the process, how achievable it is, and then the end results maybe is the second step. But this is exactly what we're doing now. We need to spread the message about how to save these oak woodlands, and fire is one of many tools to do just that.
I think many people, oh, go ahead, Sasha, sorry.
I know, I think I would add to that. So anytime we just lecture people, we're less likely to be effective in getting any message that we want to get across. But and I would add to that, Douglas firs are not inherently bad. They're a native species and we love them. We just want to also be able to love the oak woodlands and the coastal prairies and have that mosaic resilience across the landscape where the Douglas firs are where they thrive and they are not taking over these other ecosystems that are more fire adapted to that low intensity fire that they need frequently. So that nuance is important, and a great way to educate people around oak woodland and Doug fir encroachment is to actually walk through what is an encroached oak woodland and look at the oaks and point them out and recognize them and highlight them, and then also look at the trees. And if you have a way to cut one tree down or core it and show how young the Douglas firs are, that can also be an effective way to show what has happened in process on the landscape. So I would say anytime you're trying to teach people something, engaging them in it, in exploration is really valuable and important. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks. We have another comment about what recommendations do you have for burning blackberry and willow in seasonally wet areas? What conditions are we looking for?
Andres, do you want to jump it?
Ability side of that, yeah. So if I got it, it was blackberry, and what was the other one?
Blackberry and willow in seasonally wet areas.
So basically what I hear you saying is that it's going to be drying out a lot later, but the areas adjacent would be much more prone to receptive fire behavior. And that's a tough one, because if it gets out of it, and it's going to be able to probably go to a wildfire pretty easy. It might not be the right tool. Also, berries are tough to burn unless you've had a very old growth one where it's got a lot of woody stems in it. I've been able to burn those very successfully in a creek or those kind of areas near a creek, where you're not doing soil erosion issues, anything like that. And it's because of the woody, old, material within that. So it really comes down to how much sunlight it has, and then ultimately, is it even the right thing to do in that area? And maybe it's not. So it can be done. It might be pushing the limits a little bit on all the factors that make fire, efficient enough to burn it with complete consumption.
Yeah. In limited areas with Himalayan blackberry, so the non-native one, we've used a weed whacker with a metal blade attachment on the head and cut the standing stems and thickets and let them dry and desiccate on the surface, and then burned that, which has helped reduce the amount of blackberry that then resprouts and comes back, and increases our burn window for it, because we're basically like creating more dead material on the surface, kind of like I was saying earlier with the lap and scatter, which so that increased amount of material means more accessibility to anything that is resprouting, and it's all small, so you can just reach in there and grab it because there's no thicket, and increased soil surface heating, which allows for reduced resprouting. So that's been helpful for us, along with making a wider burn window. But that's pretty intensive treatment, so it depends on how big your area is that you're thinking about. It's hard work.
There's a comment from Bonnie. She has a unique situation. Well, maybe not so unique. So property that was burned in the Walbridge, the 2020 Walbridge fire, and the trees that survived have now blown down after the winter storm. So the ground is covered in dead trees as well as new growth. Do you have any thoughts about the potential for using fire in that kind of situation?
So Sasha, I'll let you talk about the ecological side of that. I think the takeaway here is I think the ultimate purpose, well, not the one of many of the purposes of having this low intensity fire and not letting it get large is to avoid that type of fire to begin with. With the Walbridge fire did a lot of damage and it scorched those trees, and you have this, we call it nuking, or this killing of an entire, ecosystem. And now you have all that aftermath and you're dealing for a very long time, versus low intensity fire is going to just have a smaller impact window of a couple of years and it becomes fire resilient. So it feels like in a lot of that area, we've kind of lost that battle, but we want to avoid that. And using fire to avoid those is kind of the big push here, is just to say, hey, it can be done in order to not get there. So as far as fuel on the ground, that would be a tough one. You have very large fuels that might be larger than what prescribed fire might be doing. It might be, hand treatment, things of that nature. But there's a lot of opportunity. Maybe Sasha could speak on it for other things, opportunistic plants to come up. I've been through that area and I've seen nothing but broom popping up, and it's just it doesn't look good. So I think the big thing is let's try to avoid fire getting that large if we can by use of prescribed fire.
And let me just quickly ask you, Andres, there was a comment here about any means, has fire been used to remove the Scotch broom that's coming in?
I'm gonna let Sasha answer that one because that's a tricky number. You got to do it right. We can burn just about everything, but whether or not there's treatments to it. So Sasha, take that one.
Yeah, I would say like it's not described what kind of trees or what kind of new growth in the Wallbridge footprint, but yeah, if they're in the area that, or one of the preserves that I work at Ottoman Canyon Ranch is Bouverie Preserve. It had the Nuns Fire go through in 2017, and now we are supporting a lot of other landowners around the Bay Area in similar situations that had high intensity fire go through their properties. Some of the general recommendations, not knowing the details of this site, I would like leave the logs on the landscape. You're not going to be able to do much about them probably right now, but you could like pile burn the tops of the trees, like all the smaller materials and other stems, just to get those logs flat on the ground and get some of that smaller material taken care of. And then if they're hardwoods and they're resprouting, you can nudge those back toward a tree structure from a shrub structure by thinning the resprouts down to 3 or 4 stems. And that'll encourage those 3 or 4 stems that you leave to grow faster because the tree will put more vigor into those. It's kind of the same effect as them being browsed down, and then only the winners quickly get invested in by the roots. So those are some things you can do there. If you have broom in the understory, and just kind of pivoting to that broom question too, broom is really tricky. Hand pulling is great for broom if you have the resources to invest in hand pulling in the winter. And then like fire does flush the entire seed bed, which is amazing because otherwise broom will be germinating for like 75 years. So over your entire lifetime, you'll never get rid of all of the broom. But if you burn it, which happens in the wildfires, it all gets flushed at once. So that all of that seed bed comes up. And if you can take other mitigative action after that seed flush, like whatever you have to do, some people will take a propane torch in the middle of winter and just torch all of the new growth as it's coming up when it's small. But whatever you can do to deal with that new flush in that first year before it goes to seed, you'll be able to completely like pretty much stop the broom in its tracks. But it does mean like a wildfire or a prescribed burn, burning it, germinate the entire seed bank that's underground, and then you got to do a follow-up treatment to get rid of that whole new flush of plants, or else it's a perpetuating problem. Probably too late for anything in the 2020 Wallbridge fire footprint, but for future wildfires or prescribed burns you might plan, those are options.
So we have a couple more questions that I think we can get to after our next little exercise. What we wanted to do was just to quickly give you a chance to play expert and evaluate a habitat based upon what you've just heard. And we're going to divide you into just some breakout rooms just automatically. And the idea, if you could turn on your camera and just chat with the other people, we're going to give you a link to a 360-degree photo and just ask you to chat about the following questions. So the questions are, what do you see in this video in terms of the forest resilience and not video, what do you see in this picture in terms of the forest resilience and in terms of what fire behavior might happen? Why might you choose to burn here, and why might you not choose to burn at this site? And when we come back, we'll ask Sasha and Andres the same question.
One 360 shot.
We did want to just hear a little bit from you. If you could type in the chat what you saw in the video and what kind of action you might take to steward this property, especially with regards to fire. That would be great just to hear from you and get a little bit of insight on your thoughts. At the same time, we're going to ask Andres and Sasha to describe to us what they saw in that image, what considerations came up for them. So let's start with Sasha.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. There are numerous ways you could do it, but I think either I would do a prescribed burn first and leave those furs in there so that my fire behavior was minimal. And then I could go back in after that and cut all of the dead furs that died from that prescribed fire that I did. And start building a program from there, and I could pile burn those or lop and scatter them. Or if I weren't going to do that, I would thin only the dug firs that are piercing directly through standing oak canopy. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, sometimes these oaks that have been competing with firs for a while have been reaching as high as they can, as quickly as they can, rather than sprawling the way they would if they weren't competing, because they're up against these dug fir trees. And that can make them really sensitive to sudden wind. So if you go and you thin all of those dug firs, all of a sudden those oak trees are going to have a lot more exposure to wind, and they're going to have a lot more exposure to water availability, which can also be a reason that oaks suddenly come down. So I would thin just underneath the pierced canopy, get rid of those immediate competitors, leave the buffers in between, do a prescribed burn, either after doing a pile burn of the ones that I had cut, or if I lopped and scattered them, I'd lop and scatter them away from the bases of the oak trees, because I don't want to add heat right at the base of the oak trees. So yeah, either of those types of overall treatments. But those are some of the thoughts that come to mind for me.
Great. And I see some great comments in the chat too. It might be nice if you took a look at some of those and to make comments. Andres, what came up for you in that image?
I love walking with people who see it from the ecology side. I always take someone out with me because it just gives me balance. So I'm going to do this from the controllability side only, even though I see so many other things here. So on the ground, I see, a leaf litter and, a lot of 10s and 100-hour fuels and some larger. And those are those sticks you're seeing on the ground. And that seems like a really good composite to do some slow intensity fire on the ground. It looks like the site, if I'm reading this right, is mostly flat, with one side having a little bit of a slope, which would improve the way fire would run through it. I also notice that there's when I'm looking around, I see a lot of light on one portion, which to me is solar radiation. It's gonna preheat things. It's not gonna take as much fire to actually ignite or to consume those areas, because they've been preheated by the sun. And you'll see different fire activity in those areas versus in the shade, where we're going to have just a different fire effect completely. I also noticed that being that this is a deciduous stand, that there's a lot of light coming through, right? And we just talked about that, but there's also moss, and the way it's going to go up these trees, depending on what the owner's objective is. If this is a larger area, sometimes you do a little natural selection. I'll let Sasha speak to that, where you get some type of limb loss or even complete tree mortality, because it gets into these weak openings in the trees. But there's a lot of these that have moss on it. At least it appears that they do, which means that I'm going to need to guard those if I want to protect those trees, or they may go up into limbs as they go around. So as far as fire going up, not in a large, very hot way, but just going up the trees and entering spots that maybe you wouldn't want them, that is a factor. The little fuels, as far as the live ones go, like the dug fir, the very, very small ones, a lot of these would be damaged pretty good with the low intensity fire and have a good effect. So I see this as a very doable unit. I don't know what the edges are, if there's roads or topography changes outside of it, because one of the things we look at is the actual fire where we want to treat, but it's really important to know what's adjacent to it, and we can't quite see that. But my guess is this is a larger property where we would have some liberties to make some control lines, because that's really important. The last thing here, and we can't see it, but accessibility to water. is huge in making sure that we have enough to put things out if they do go up these trees, or just, stop and spot fires, or escape, should I say, from happening. So I see this as a very, very doable site, with not a lot of issues.
This is great. I think one of the things that's come up is, in looking at the chat, is that in many of the breakout sessions, people are focusing on, the basic things of thinning, pile burning, various aspects that we've talked about. How would you, deal with this site? And what it was amazing to me is just listening to Sasha and Andres, is listening to the complexity of options that are there, that are specific to each site. And so I think that just brings home the comments that we heard earlier about, yeah, you could try this on your own, but it probably would be a lot better to bring in people who really are able to read your particular landscape. So if you can get to the point of, you want to have fire, that would be, the next step would be to bring somebody else in. There are a couple questions just now about some of your comments. And Sasha, there was a question from Jennifer about what's the benefit of prescribed burning first and thinning after?
Yeah, so the Klamath has been doing prescribed fire as a first entry treatment for about 20 years now, in oak woodlands that are dug for encroached. So that's where I first really opened my eyes to that as a really viable option. And we've been using it around here for a few years, and it's been really effective. And really the benefit is that, everyone really focuses on ladder fuels, and ladder fuels are the cause of fire moving from the surface into the canopy. But surface fuels really drive the majority of fire behavior. So your rate of spread and your intensity are going to be really driven by your continuous fine fuel loading and surface fuel loading, not just your fine fuels. So if you have 100 years of fire suppression, you have a lot of accumulated surface fuels already. And if you start with just burning that, you're reducing that and bringing yourself back to a baseline before you go adding more surface fuels. If you start by thinning, you're adding more surface fuels to an already fire suppressed surface fuel accumulated landscape. And if you don't actually get your burn window right away and you let those lop and scatter fuels sit on the landscape for years, you have the possibility of a wildfire beating you to the punch and just burning that extremely hot when you don't want it to happen. And sometimes the thinning as that first entry treatment, as that first entry effort, is just too cost prohibitive and effort prohibitive for people, whereas they can light fire to that understory more easily and actually with less resources if they don't cut the ladder fuels first. And so, yeah, as long as you're getting your burn window right, you absolutely can do a broadcast burn without cutting the ladder fuels first, and not have that fire transition to the canopy. And part of that is your prescription and your burn window, and part of that is the way you light it. You just bring fire down from the top through the landscape. You can prevent that ladder fuel transition up into the canopy, and meet a lot of your objectives right off the bat. And once you've killed those Doug firs, they're already sucking less water. They're already competing for, or less competitive for light. So you're already improving the ecological health of your landscape, and you're reducing the surface fuels right off the bat, so that fire resilience to a wildfire is already improved. So you're already meeting some of your objectives, just lighting fire, and then you can deal with continued stewardship from there. It just looks ugly to a lot of people because then you have a lot of standing dead Douglas firs. So that's something to have in mind. It doesn't look as pretty as the lop and scatter treatment, but it can be more effective and easier to make happen in a shorter timeline.
Great. Thanks. I think that also addresses Jason's question about, could you do a cool prescribed burn here before treatment, even when it's full of ladder fuels? And I think that addresses that as well. I want to thank all of you for coming, but also specifically to thank Chief Avila and Dr. Berlman for joining us today. I think it was really exciting. I almost want to do another one of these with just more photos for each, different sites, and just discuss all these different opportunities in different areas.
If you have any questions about today or contacts you need to make, you can reach me at rawlinsm at sonoma.edu. And I thank you all so much for being here. It was and our speakers were awesome, and thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you, everybody. Stay
Thank
safe out
you.
there.